Welcome.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Pat Ogden. I'm the founder of Sensorimotor Psychotherapy Institute, and I am super excited about this particular webinar, Sensorimotor Psychotherapy in Context. Um, I'm one of those white folks who thought I had a handle on racial issues and diversity, et cetera, because I've had a lot of experience. My family's biracial. In the 60s, I did a lot of work with civil rights and so forth. And I am really embarrassed to say, until about 5 or 6 years ago, I didn't have a handle on it. And at that time, after helping to organize a conference on culture, I realized how important it was to start to look at the impact of mainstream values and white supremacist and heteropatriarchal ideologies on sensory psychotherapy and on psychology in general. So that's what this webinar is about. We're looking at sensory motor psychotherapy, which, like the majority of contemporary modalities, implicitly contains the values of white bias and white culture. So, several years ago, I started to work with the four co-presenters of this webinar, my colleagues that I've learned so much from in these last years. We've written an article together on this topic, and they were consultants on a book that will be coming out on sensorimotor psychotherapy in context. And all of these folks have made social justice and social cultural awareness a center of their work. Um, so this webinar is going to introduce the impact of Western perspectives on sensory psychotherapy and on psychotherapy in general. And each of us are going to present specific elements, give you kind of an introduction of what we're going to teach in the webinar. So I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Sherry Taylor. She's going to start
Awesome.
off
Thank
here.
you. Thank you, Pat. So thank you for joining us, whoever's out there. And I just want to appreciate my ancestors, first of all. And I didn't want to appreciate, all of the folks that I've worked with and my colleagues here today and share with you that this is a really special chapter. And this will be a really special webinar because I do think that perhaps it can go without saying, but right now, these are the conversations that feel really critical to be having in the world. So Dr. Sherry Taylor, Dr. Sherry, Dr. Taylor, and I am a friend and fan of Sensorimotor Psychotherapy Institute and every person on this that I supported and that we wrote this article about. In my life, I am a consultant for organizations and people, in fact, who are trying to transform their organizations to become anti-racist, anti-oppressive. But I also do consult around somatic considerations and perspectives, et cetera, et cetera. So you can get to know me later. But I'm very excited to say that for our webinar, I get to talk about the attitudes and actions that are that beautifully frame how to bring more of a sociocultural lens to your work, right? Your work as a therapist, your work as a mental health practitioner, your work in general, truly as a person. And while I really, I'm going to say a little bit about actions. I really want to invite all of us to reconsider the importance of the awareness, right? Daryl Wing Sue brought up that there's a three-pronged piece to, what initially was formulated as cultural competence. So it's the awareness, knowledge, and skills. And I feel like we've done a great job, right? Always with the knowledge and skills, but sometimes we've we can all do better with our awareness, right? And so in the webinar, me talking about just kind of giving a refresher how we've moved from cultural competence with Gerald Wing Sue into more cultural humility, which was a concept put forward by Turbilon and Garcia. And then more recently, our psychoanalytic siblings have introduced, Anton Hart introduced this idea of radical openness. And it feels like this sort of like trinity of sorts really provides a great frame. And then sensorimotor psychotherapy comes in and just, it really becomes expansive and useful. And I say this as someone who's used it. So what I'm hoping to, again, encourage, invite, and give some examples of is that not only is it a window of tolerance, as Siegel and my dear Pat Ogden have offered us, but it's a socioculturally attuned window of tolerance, right? There are different edges that we meet and that interact with our physiological, our embodied being that have to do with the ways that our identities intersect, and not just intersect, sort of in our inner landscape, but intersect when we're engaging with another. And I think that there's some things that this webinar will offer you that may be helpful to your own sort of supervision and consultation and your own formulations, but actually be really useful in the moment with your clients when it feels that there has now been something introduced into the room that is regarding an intersection of identity that has an underpinning of power and privilege. And, it's a moment to truly slow down. There are resources that you can offer your client. There's ways to track. And so hoping that that will be really helpful. I found it useful. I think in conversations with my colleagues here, we found it useful. And then hopefully you'll go on and buy and read the book and read the chapter. But yeah, so that's just a little bit of what I'll be doing and hope to see you there. So now I'm going to hand it off to Laya.
Thank you, Sherry. And thank you all that you're looking and watching this live Facebook. And if not, you are going to be able to see later, maybe join us in the webinar. The webinar is still, it feels to me, the outcome of our conversations that are still very much in progress. Since this work is never done and it continues to challenge me, to challenge us in very pertinent conversations. My name is Laya Jorba. I am a faculty member of the Sensorimotor, and I run a very small clinic also for Medicaid clients, and a little bit of a private practice where I work a lot with immigration. I am a privileged immigrant, and I think that that has informed so much the way that I look at body and bodies in different contexts. So I'm going to be focusing a little bit on that and the norms that shape us, the way that we speak somatically, depending on who we are with and in what context, what posture, gestures, movements, what nonverbals are being seen and shown depending on who we are interacting with. It's an aspect that really is exciting to me to speak to you all about. And for instance, who looks first, who has in this relationship and also in your therapeutic hour, how all of those nonverbal cues indicate locations of power. Who holds, like the gaze is one of the indicators, and what are those meanings that are more connected to culture, to our personal stories, to our relationship of the content that we are bringing up. So that's one aspect I'm going to be talking about. Another is also in this US context, like I am white presenting here, and probably if I go back home, that wouldn't be the first identity that I would name about myself. And these specific identities in this context, I'm going to be talking about some of the norms in the US context too. The norms about size, about skin color, about ableism, about age. and how these create some projections in the therapeutic hour and informs sometimes how we ask questions and how we uh, direct the session in way of another. And as a sensorimotor psychotherapist, we had a great opportunity to use those basic skills about tracking, awareness, mindfulness to bring those pieces into the room. And lastly, I will be talking a little bit about these Western ideas of what inform the way that we look at bodies. For instance, one of those ideas is the dualism between the body and the mind, and the privilege of the reason over other ways of knowing, the sensing, the feeling, and how this can maybe show up in you as a therapist, prior privileging a little bit too much or leaning too much in psychoeducation or in research that has been done, or how clients show up sometimes just being very ashamed of body states and wanting to control bodies. So that we're going to ask some few questions about how these Western ideas and heritage actually shows up also in our context. So I'm very excited to expand on that. This is unfolding conversations that never end. So probably I'm not going to give you all that you need to know, but maybe prompting some of these questions that are very relevant and very important to all of us. And thank you. I hope to see you in the webinar, and I'll hand it to Raymond.
Thank you, Laia, and welcome everybody to this Facebook Live. I have to say that I am delighted to be here and also to be part of this very important webinar that not only, as some of my colleagues have said, is so pertinent to the work that we as therapists do in the world, but also very pertinent to the things that are happening all around us that call for us to really pay attention to what happens inside of us, engage with our clients, how we engage with ourselves, what are the sources of knowledge that we come into therapy with, and what do we do when these things do show up in the therapeutic context. My name is Raymond Rodriguez. I am also part of the faculty of the Sensorimotor Psychotherapy Institute. I am a gay Afro-Latino therapist out of New York City, where I have a small private practice, and I also run and founded a group psychotherapy practice that works primarily with Black and brown folks. So my part in the webinar will be talking about bias, bias explicit and also implicit bias, microaggressions, and to provide some strategies on what to do, again, when these things do show up in the therapeutic context. So a little bit about bias. What is bias? Well, bias is the attitudes, the stereotypes, prejudices that we hold towards people that look like us, that are part of reference groups that we belong to, but also towards people that we perceive as different from us. Bias is the way that we assess the world and also how the world assesses us. This is a normal process of association and also categorization. Bias is something that we often refer to as mental shortcuts about how we engage with people. Bias can happen in explicit ways or in implicit ways. And so when we say explicit bias, these are the things that we are aware of about ourselves, ideas, behaviors, attitudes that we are aware of, that we know about ourselves. They're reflected in our internal processes, in our emotions, and also in our somatic responses. On the other hand, implicit bias is the type of bias that is out of our awareness, that are governed by processes that are often reflective and automatic. It's the things that we don't know, or what we don't think that we think. And in the webinar, we're going to go more into depth about what those look like, those explicit biases and also those implicit biases, and how they show up and how we operate, and particularly in the therapeutic context, from those spaces. And so it's important to recognize and understand bias because bias associations can lead to microaggressions. And microaggressions was defined by Dr. Derwin Su as brief and common day verbal, behavioral, and environmental indignities, intentional or not, that communicate hostile and derogatory and negative messages. And they are based on our social identities like race, gender, sexual orientation, religious affiliation, etc. And guess what? Microaggressions are extremely common. We have all perpetrated them and we have all been the victim of them. And as you can imagine, and as you probably have experienced yourself, they do enter the therapeutic context. So in our webinar, I am going to go more into detail in what that looks like and how to navigate those moments, because if you have experienced a microaggression in a therapeutic context, you know how difficult those moments can be. So we want to equip you with strategies on how to address them. So specifically, some strategies that we're going to talk about is how to examine our denial of bias. It is very hard for us to see ourselves as having bias. You know, we all want to be socially acceptable. So it is sometimes easier, unfortunately, to be in denial of those bias. So ourselves, how to interrogate our attitudes, our behavior, what we think, or again, if it's implicit, what we don't know about ourselves. Also, we're going to look at how these biases and what happens around microaggressions in our bodies. What is a sensory motor awareness, sensory motor response to those moments? Sometimes it's an uneasy feeling that we may not be aware of sort of more cognitively, but that somatically is very present. And so how to lean into that, how to pay attention, how to bring it forward, and most certainly how to work with them. We're also going to look at how to find sources of support. I strongly believe, as this panel reflects, that it is critical for us to find who are the fellow travelers with whom we can have dialogue and grow together and really wrestle with how these things live within ourselves. And lastly, one very important strategy that I think it's critical for all of us to have is a very good dose of self-compassion. Is how do we hold compassion towards ourselves, our learning edges, and our growing pains also. And how do we do that? We're going to provide in this webinar some very specific skills in how to do that. So now I'm going to pass it on to Mary Choi, who is going to talk a little bit more about her part in this webinar. Thank you.
Thank you, Raymond. Hello, everyone. My name is Mary Choi, and I am a faculty member at SPI. I am a clinical social worker with a small practice in Washington, D.C., as well as one just outside of Baltimore, Maryland. I am a first-generation Asian American born in the U.S. to immigrant parents. And as such, working towards racial equity and social justice has really been at the bedrock of who I am and what I do. So I'm really honored and happy to be talking with you today, as well as next week, about a topic that's so very near and dear to my heart. So when thinking about what to present on to help fellow clinicians navigate the oftentimes gray and murky waters of providing culturally sensitive care, I thought I would discuss a few of the common pitfalls that we as clinicians might fall into when working with populations from diverse sociocultural backgrounds or with clients that hold one or more places of marginalized identity. I, as Sherry talked about as well, really believe that awareness is the key to addressing so many of the issues that we might face in the therapy room with folks from different cultural backgrounds. And so my hope is that next week's webinar will help increase that awareness at least a little bit. So one of the pitfalls I will be talking about next week is around a mindset that I have seen many clinicians struggling with, especially as of late when working with clients from diverse sociocultural backgrounds. That mindset is one of feeling like we as clinicians have to get it right with our clients, be it about race, and especially about race in our current climate, I have seen with clinicians, but sexual orientation, gender identity, culture, ableism, as Laya spoke about. There's a feeling of needing to say the right thing in just the right way, or to use the correct languaging, feeling like it's not okay to make a mistake, or it's not okay to not be an expert. And this is a tricky place to be in when A, we might not be an expert, but also B, when we're wanting to be in a place of, as Sherry mentioned, radical openness and cultural humility with our clients. So on Wednesday, I'll be talking a little bit about how we might address this and other pitfalls in a general sense, but I'll also be talking about how we might navigate these pitfalls from an SP perspective and through the use of some of the foundational skills that we use in SP, such as tracking. Tracking meaning observing the present moment experience of what we see and hear and feel in our bodies and otherwise in the therapy room, both with our clients and also, and very importantly, with what we track within ourselves. So that's what we will be taking a little bit of a deeper dive with next week, and I'm looking forward to doing so with you all.
I got more and more excited listening to everybody because I realized that this webinar is going to be like a consolidation of everything that I've learned from you all and other, BIPOC in my world over the past 4 or 5 years. So I'm just thrilled to be able to share it with all of you in this format with my esteemed colleagues. And I hope you'll join us. We've tried to make the pricing accessible with a sliding scale, so you'll be able to afford it. All right. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for watching. Thanks to my co-presenters, and we'll see you next week.